When most people think of shamanism, the first image that comes to mind is the idea of the enlightened master who is charged with leading their indigenous community to spiritual ascension and awakening. But the ethnographic reality that we find in the actual villages is far from that idea. In fact, there is a dark side, and there are black magic aspects of shamanism that are often misunderstood or overlooked by popular media. And what I'd like to do today is talk about the seminal volume named In Darkness and Secrecy, edited by Robin Wright and Neil Whitehead. And this is a very interesting look at the actual practices of black magic, dark shamanism, occult sorcery in different parts of the Amazon rainforest. And the diversity of case studies from this volume is essential for the work because it reminds us that the shamanism as it is practiced in one particular community does not necessarily stand for the entirety of shamanism as it is applied or practiced in the entire swath of the Amazon rainforest. And we have to think about the individual regions, the historical particularities, the histories of the political climate, the environment, and other aspects in order to understand what is happening at each village level in order to come to the theoretical approaches that this book provides. So it is looking at different themes and different regions across mostly Brazil, but there are also important case studies that were conducted in Venezuela, Guyana, and even Peru. So while most of them were taking place in Brazil, we have to think about the political history of each of these nations and these top-down effects as they impacted the different indigenous villages. And that is an important point that each of the chapters makes, is that as they begin, they establish the setting. They explain where they conducted the field work, what seasons, what years they were in, so that we have a very specific context for each of these case studies. And then from there, we can talk about some of the generalizations that could be made. I also wanted to say a few things about the shamanism as a theoretical and as an analytical subject. I am aware that shamanism is itself a very controversial idea, and not even all anthropologists have a consensus on whether this is a valuable subject or category to use. But I think it is, because we do find very similar practices not only across the Amazon rainforest, but indeed across many parts of North, Central, and South America. And we can also compare this to similar phenomena that are especially known from the Himalayas and Siberia. And so there are three basic principles that I find useful for talking about shamanism as a general idea or as a general religious institution. The first of all is the idea of the ecstatic experience, the ability of the shaman to undergo an out-of-body experience and project this consciousness into the spirit worlds, into the worlds beyond. They could be the heavenly worlds above, the terrestrial plane, or even the underworld. So that is a very important part of it. The second is that this is done in a trance state, an altered state of consciousness, that more recently anthropologists are starting to use the term dissociation to talk about this shift in consciousness that is essential for the out-of-body ecstatic experience. And the third is that when you are in these other realms, these other realities, there are other beings there. This ties to the idea of animism, the concept of all the phenomena of nature having their own souls. These things have their own spirits. They can be gods or spirits or other sorts of transcendent beings. But when you are in these other states of consciousness, you are in these other realms, they appear to you and you engage with them in some way. There is some sort of interaction with the gods and the spirits of the natural phenomena that guide the sun, the moon, the rivers, and so on. So these are very useful ways of thinking about what qualifies as shamanism. Because the orientation of this book is anthropological, the main question that has to be asked is why? Why do the native Amazonians believe in black magic and dark shamanism? Why do they do it? And how do these communities justify the practice of this often violent application? We have many detailed case studies of the ways in which people are taught how to use poisons or how to blow magical incantations toward a victim that could be within their own community or in a more distant one. It defines what what kinds of people are the victims of these magical practices, and why are they targeted? There are also questions of who learns this, and is there some sort of specialization? Are there specific roles for these people who learn these different ways of using magic to attack other people? And there, in some cases, there are very specialized titles, but in other situations, such as the Arara of Eastern Brazil, the everybody has the potential to learn both light and dark aspects of shamanism. All the men are expected to know how to dream, to know how to participate in shamanic rituals and practices for both good and bad. So they have responsibilities on how to apply this appropriately. And when these rules are transgressed or broken, then there could be social consequences. There could be repercussions. So there is a lot to ask about the social aspects of how shamanism is reckoned and how it should be used both within the community and upon people in other communities. So these are very important social dimensions to the practice and the understanding of Black magic in each of the case studies in this volume. We also cannot talk about shamanism in the Amazon without thinking about the nature of the rainforest itself, which is a vast and deep forest that is filled with with many kinds of spiritual and natural entities that inform the ways in which the shaman engages with the environment. They're both the natural and the supernatural worlds around them. And the communities are aware of the food chains, the food webs that in which the people themselves are situated. And this is a very interesting idea that I have encountered, especially in these studies of shamanism in the Amazon rainforest, is the idea that, kind of going back to the principle of animism, every creature, every plant has its own spirit, it has its own soul. But especially in the Amazon, there is also the idea that they are not only ensouled, they are each individual people. Every plant, every tree is a person. Every animal is a person. And actually being on the Amazon River gave me a chance to meditate on this concept. So it is a very interesting idea to think about. To be a person, you also have your own volition, you have your own intentions. So every organism in the Amazon is seen as its own person with its own willpower, its own volition. So you have this network of sentient and beings with souls, with spirits that have their own intentions. So everything has its own force and its own agency to act within this larger network of willful, powerful beings. And that is the world in which the Amazon shaman participates. And perhaps the best metaphor to explain the idea of the rainforest from the shamanic perspective is to think about a spiritual food chain. Just as the rainforest itself is populated with beings that will prey upon each other. So you have the herbivores, you have carnivores, you have predators, you have secondary predators, you have apex predators, and most important of these is the jaguar. So you have this food chain, this model of a food chain that is related to the shaman as himself or herself a predator, as a hunter, that is also a part of this massive food chain. So there are many cases in this work that talk about not being able to prey upon not only the physical body of the victim, but in some cases even attacking the very soul of the people that they may be targeting for different practices of black magic or dark shamanism. So it is not only bodies hunting bodies, but also souls hunting souls, even destroying souls, or let's say scatter bombing, attacking multiple victims with one psychic attack or one black magic attack at a time. So these are very visceral and very graphic accounts of the ways in which a shaman can be a very formidable and powerful being that will be called upon to rectify an injustice or to retaliate against the violence from not only within the community, but also, say, raiders from a foreign or an outside community. And so this is related to the idea that goes back to theoretical frameworks that look at the shaman as a very ancient institution in the history of humanity. And we do find in many other parts of the world, such as other parts of the Americas, that the shaman practice is related to very old practices of hunting. So just it could go back to when many of these societies were originally hunter-gatherer nomads. They were foragers that were wondering about. And the Inuits would be a very good example of a modern case study or a modern society that that follows this idea that we find shamanism, especially among hunter-gatherer nomadic societies. And so we see that in the Amazon, this idea of the shaman related to hunting explains why there is so much hunting imagery, so much predatory imagery, especially with ideas of the shaman as a jaguar, in some effectively becoming a jaguar. In some of these languages, in some of these villages, the shaman has effectively become a human form of this idea of a jaguar. And in some cases, they may be so powerful, so magically charged that they have to separate themselves from the rest of the community because they have become too much like a jaguar and will start to see their fellow villagers as prey to be attacked when they should be out and hunting, the enemy instead of their own kinsmen. So in some case, here again, we have to think about the social aspects and consequences of being of possessing this kind of magic. And this is something that I found recurrently throughout this volume. A theme that I found especially interesting in this book is the role of myth that villagers have for explaining the origins of black magic and dark shamanism. So going to the idea of myth, myth is a tale or an account that it seeks to explain how things are in the world by looking at the events that happened in the times of creation, in mythical time, a time beyond the reckonings of our normal space-time perception. And in some cases, for some of these communities, this mythical time is not simply something that happened in the ancient and remote past, but it is continually coexisting in a separate reality from our own. So what happened in mythical time is an ongoing process that continues to impact our experiences of this natural space-time reality. So in some, the events of myth continue to have an effect on what happens in the present day. And we find in these cases, there are cultural heroes or other mythical beings that set about, like say, the events that have led to the institutions of shamanism and magic. There are a couple references to the culture hero Kuwai, who committed social taboos or who was wronged and was looking to seek justice against relatives who had offended him. So he invents different rituals and incantations and spells that he will use in order to correct these injustices upon him. Or he may learn how to use poisons. And this knowledge has been passed down through generations, so that the shamans still know how to use incantations, ritual language, spell work, and poisons, magical tools that they use in order to continue this practice that was initiated, that was set as the precedent by these culture heroes. There is a very interesting case of the macaw as another mythical creator who set up this really graphic, very bloody, very sanguine account of how the macaw became a predator that would feast upon the blood, the other bodily humors, and I think even the soul of the humans that it seeks to prey upon. So the macaw is another important mythical figure with a study by Johannes Wilberg among the Warao of Venezuela. And so there are these really interesting case studies that look to the role of these mythical figures and how their initial practices, these precedented events, have been continued among shamans in the modern day. An important idea that comes out from this work is that shamanism is not only an ancient institution, but also a continually evolving one that is often responding to changes in climate, changes in political history, changes in access to technology, and how these affect the indigenous communities and their practices of shamanism and magic. And in some cases, there are even considerations of how the native cultures themselves are impacting and influencing national level politics and culture. As, for example, with ideas of the Kainaima, which is this practice of a dark shamanism that Neil Whitehead outlines with great detail in his work from his work in Guyana. So shamanism has this kind of top-down and bottom-up exchanges between national level, say mainstream culture, as well as local expressions of these indigenous beliefs and practices. One last remark I will say about In Darkness and Secrecy is that the case studies themselves have richly detailed accounts of how shamanism is understood, and also cases and also some descriptions of how it is practiced. We have some ritual chanting. We have details of the medicines, the poisons, the ritual practices, the initiation rites, the lineages, the social institutions and categories, the roles and the titles that these practitioners may assume in these individual case studies. So this volume is also a very good, look at not only the ideas of black magic and dark shamanism as a general concept, but also many as individual case studies. There is an impressive selection of details about what is actually done in each of these communities. So if you wanted to look at not just the darker side of shamanism, but also shamanism overall as a general practice and a concept in the Amazon rainforest, then this is an essential work, and one that I highly recommend if you want to look at not just the darker side of these practices, but also a general idea of the nature of these practices from the diversity of case studies presented across the area. So this was a really fascinating book, and one that I highly recommend for people who want to learn more about these practices from not only a historical perspective, a contemporary ethnographic, anthropological perspective, but also, say, a general view of magic and shamanism among the indigenous communities of the Amazon rainforest. And I'll talk further about these in the next episode in this series on Native American shamanism and magic in South America. So in the next installment, I will look at a case study from the west end of the Amazon with the Quechua of Ecuador. So I look forward to talking further in the next episode.